Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, that PhD is going to be kicking into relatively high gear as we dive in to Mariette Navarro's Ultramarine. This is a book that has come out this year in its second English translation from the French. It actually won a translation prize from Albertine. Albertine is this amazing bookstore in New York City. It's in the French embassy, and it is the most incredible building. It's some like Big Family's former mansion, and they have done the most amazing things with it. But one thing that is so cool is that when you are there, you are technically on French soil, so you don't have to pay any taxes for the books, which honestly, the taxes are not that big a deal, but there's something kind of crazy about being on French soil and looking through the shelves and finding all this amazing French literature. They also, of course, have it all in translation. So if you are ever on the Upper East Side of New York City, it is definitely worth taking a look at. If you're on the YouTube, I'll put some pictures up. So Albertine gives this prize for translating books well into English from the French. And this book, Ultramarine, won that prize, and I think that's why it caught my attention. However, there is a novel that wins this prize every year, and they don't all catch my attention. This one was very interesting to me because it is written by someone who is a playwright and a poet, and I'm always interested in how someone who is really like a poet, a kind of dyed-in-the-wool poet, and in fact, like someone who is a really serious playwright, I'm always interested to see how that kind of métier translates itself into a novel. In this case, the novel is very short. It's almost a novella. I think the technical cutoff for novella is 140 pages, and this one's 156 or 59 or something. And the length of the novel, because it is short, makes me feel like I can have very high expectations for the language. We touch on this every once in a while. If poetry is kind of the form of literature where every single syllable counts, every single one is load-bearing, they're all doing a huge amount of work, poetry then sort of feels like the one where the language counts the very most. Then you have a short story where you're still, you're absolutely counting on the reader to have very carefully weighed every single word. And then as you have a novel and as you have longer and longer novels, you kind of have a sense that you can sort of let the writer off the hook a little bit if every single syllable is not perfectly well chosen. I was also drawn in, I have to admit, by the cover. If you are on YouTube, I will put up an image of the cover here. I'm holding it up for those of you who are on the YouTube. There is something about the surreal nature of the cover, this idea of having a cube made out of the ocean that kind of tips her hand toward the fact that there is a real surreal kind of vein running through this book. And one of the things that I will say that I found most impressive, and this is not something that I particularly look for in any kind of literature, is that it was so tense. There was this incredible taut feeling to the book right from the start. And she does such a good job of maintaining this tension. We're going to talk about that soon. This is a book where actually not a lot happens. And they tell us right in the jacket copy here that one of the things that's going to happen is these 20 sailors go for a swim and then 21 sailors get back on board. So we have this the one kind of big occurrence in the book. They're literally telling us in the jacket copy. So I was wondering how it was that Mariette Navarro was going to keep us wondering what's happening and how she was going to maintain that kind of the uncanniness and this idea of wanting to read in order to find out what happens. And she does it very well. We're going to talk about it. She does it essentially through a series of these kinds of questions that the reader develops. This is also a book, some of you may have come here because you're wait, what happened? I don't understand what happened. And frankly, I do not have a great answer for that. At the very end, I'm going to make a little conjecture as to kind of what I think is happening or what the sort of action of the book is meaning to tell us. But this is one of those ambivalent books where there are lots of different ways that you can interpret it. And it's one of those amazing things, which can be frustrating for some readers, where you as a reader are going to see the interpretation that is correct for you. So for those of you who like an agenda, we're going to just dive on in. I keep wanting to say no pun intended, because this is a book about the ocean. But I just earlier on, I was I'm not going to say no pun intended or pun intended because I'm going to continually say that we are diving into this book about the ocean. But so far as agenda, we're going to dive in. We're going to take a close look at the title, which is a very interesting thing because it's different in English and French. And if you are an English speaker, you wouldn't necessarily get the nuance because the title in English is Ultramarine and the title in French is Ultramarin. So it looks very similar, but there's some nuance there that I find very interesting. We're then going to look at this tension, how it is that she keeps the reader engaged in this very kind of eerie and confusing and uncanny way throughout the entire 159 pages. We're then going to talk about the fact that at the very, very start of this book, she does this amazing thing where she is making the illogical logical. She's like making the impossible possible. And it's within the confines of the book, she's just stating that these things are possible. And as the reader, you kind of have to go along with it right from the very first sentence. And it's one of these times where literature is doing something, it's almost sort of philosophical. It's like a magic trick that she is doing that really deserves a little bit of our analysis. We're then going to take a look at the prose, just like how beautiful it is and how much it is very much a poet's prose. And then we're going to look at the close of the novel. I actually really like the close. Those of you who are longtime, I almost said longtime Albertine listeners. Actually, for those of you who are on YouTube and you can see my like bookcase behind me, this is from Albertine. This little, it's a box of note cards, but this blue with this beautiful gold around it, they have that on the ceiling. Again, if you're on the YouTube, I'll show you a picture of the ceiling right now. It's unbelievable. And part of the reason why I said Albertine, like confusing it with the Foxed Page just then, which is what I did, I just said Albertine listeners instead of Foxed Page listeners, is because many, many moons ago, I was with a bunch of kids and we were talking about how people liked or didn't like their name. And I hate my name. Kimberly is so bad. Kim is even worse. It's just like not great. It is not great. And they asked me what I would like to be called. And at the time I was reading Proust, which sounds totally pretentious, but it just wasn't. I tend to want to read really difficult things, or I used to, when we would be on vacation with our kids, because I think I was just like so mired in like kid world that I would want to escape to something that was much more adult. So I was reading Proust, and at one point the love interest is Albertine. And so I said that I wanted my name to be Albertine. So for a really long time, the kids and their friends all called me Albertine. Like that's what I would say to Starbucks, and they would write Albertine on the cup. But I actually haven't gone by Albertine for many, many years. But what I was going to say about the Foxed Page is those of you who are longtime listeners, especially those of you who have read Martyr and listened to my sort of best guess at what is happening at the end of that book, my analysis of the ending of that book, you know that I'm kind of a romantic person. I don't want things that are cloying or saccharine, and I don't love necessarily like the tied in a bow ending, but I do actually like it when things end with a relationship or with love or romance or just whatever seems optimistic for that person. So I'm not going to tell you exactly what the ending is of this book in case you have not read it yet. But I will tell you that I really like the fact that it was somewhat optimistic after all of this tension. That's probably a good time to tell you that we won't have any spoilers until the end of the lecture, and I will definitely let you know before we are going to spoil anything. Okay, so we're going to dive in. I mentioned before that I really like the cover, and I stand by that. I found the cover of this English version that was done this year. Very importantly, the name of the translator is Eve Hill Agnes. I kept wanting to say Angus, but it's Agnes. And interestingly, there was another English translation. I'm not exactly sure, if you're going to have your novel translated, essentially what you do is you sell the French version to a publisher and they find, not always, but a lot of the time, they'll find someone to translate it. But the people who are translating it, the publisher and the translator, they have the rights to the book. So it was published before by a guy named Corey. I don't remember his last name. I want to say Stanhope, but that is not correct. But this guy, Corey, did a translation of it, which I think was well received. But now we have, in relatively quick succession, another translation here by Eve Hill Agnes. So one thing I will say, I like the cover art on the English translation actually a lot better than the French version. Well, that's not true. I'm going to hold both up if you're on the YouTube. I'm going to try to. It's very awkward the way I'm holding these things right now. I like the English one better in the sense that it reflects to me like a little bit of the creepy sort of uncanniness of the novel. You probably remember, but it's like a cube of ocean, which it's very interesting to really put the emphasis here on the depths of the ocean, not on the wideness of the ocean. But also we have the little tiny freighter that is very, very small, which I think is very appropriate because a lot of the book is about sort of feeling small and feeling adrift. The French version, First of all, it looks like a cruise ship, not a freighter. And then they have like a little tiny person who's diving off the side. And part of me was like, no one ever dived? Dove? No one ever dived off the side of the freighter that we are talking about in Ultramarine. I also, the French one is kind of like playful, like it looks very like kind of sunny in some way, like it's a happy book. And I really loved a lot about this novel, but it was not a sunny book. So my preference between the cover art is actually much less interesting to me than the different nuance between the title in French and in English. So if you are a reader of English and not super fluent in French, the titles look very close. So we have Ultramarine and Ultramarin. So it's really just an S at the end of the French word versus an E at the end of the English word. But it's very interesting once you think about it. And all of you who are wanting to get more out of your reading experience should be thinking quite a bit about any given title. Ultramarine in English really refers most to that color, the color of ultramarine. I did a little sleuthing. Apparently it comes from lapis lazuli and it's like very sought after, or it used to be. Now I'm sure we can just generate it in many, many different ways. But ultramarine really refers mostly to the color. But of course, the idea of ultra meaning like extreme or beyond, if we have that prefix together with marine, what we are pointing to is something that is extreme about an experience of the ocean or something that is kind of beyond the experience of the ocean. I think it's a very good title. The word in French, ultramarin, has a kind of a different connotation though because it means overseas, outre-mer. And the idea of overseas, which we don't have that connotation in English, it's very interesting because overseas mostly means like in another country. The second definition of ultramarin in French is the color. So both of them mean the color, but French has this different nuance of also meaning overseas. So now we're going to go ahead and dive into the text. We open the book. The first thing after all of that frontis matter is a table of contents. I always think it's interesting when someone includes a table of contents. Oftentimes it will be if there are lots of chapters that are named, and I like that because sometimes it will signal to us that each one of these chapters, because they are named, that it's almost like they're kind of their own thing. They have their own title. They might sort of actually function a bit like a short story. Here, we simply have all of the chapter numbers, which are to the left, and they're all Roman numerals. And then to the right, we simply have the page number. So you could skip right over this. I'm sure many of you did. But for me, it's very interesting, and I kind of wonder what it is. I think one of the things that it did for me is as a reader, you see this, and there's kind of a starkness to it, and kind of an inevitability. It's like you're going to just plod right through and you're going to just go numerically 1 through 19. I'm actually very proud how quickly I could read that Roman numeral right there. I love Roman numerals. On the East Coast, they're everywhere on the buildings, and I love to decipher them. I'm also a little bit concerned that Roman numerals might be lost on subsequent generations. But what we have here is this kind of movement forward, like it's kind of inexorable, like we're just going to go, go, go. And there is a sense of sameness, but also a sense of opaqueness in this long list of Roman numerals. It's kind of like we don't know what they're going to contain, and she's not really telling us very much about what they contain. She's just trusting us to move sort of blindly through them. So I actually was very taken by this table of contents, even though it was very plain, and you could argue that it is really not necessary. Okay, so after the table of contents, we turn the page and we have an epigram. And we're going to spend a little time on the epigram because it is in fact very important in terms of understanding the novel. One of the things that I always say on the Foxed page here is that if you want to read better and get more out of your experience, you should pay attention to the title, also to whether or not there's a table of contents, but you should definitely pay attention to the opening. And an epigram, sometimes they're more important than others. I myself, I love an epigram. It tells you, some of them, the good ones, tell you a huge amount about what you're about to get into. They also sometimes can add like a whole entire nuance to a work that I just find really exciting. But this one, it really, I think, could point you in the right direction and really elucidate a lot of what Navarro is trying to do. So it reads this: there are the living, the dead, and sailors. So first of all, this is a quotation. It is, I heard an interview. I listened to a couple of interviews with Mariette Navarro, and she talks about this coming from antiquity. It is often misquoted as being from Aristotle, but it's not, apparently. This is all coming straight from Google. I did not have this quotation just like in the back of my mind. You can see nuances of it in A Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I actually was so interested in this idea of being out to sea, you know, being as a sailor is this kind of liminal space. I just really never thought about it very much. But in these ancient texts, I mean, the idea of going to sea in Greece, of course, would have been very important. And then if you're an English romantic poet in the middle of the 19th century, you're thinking a lot about, you know, the imperial thrust of England and all of this time that people are spending at sea. And when I say liminal space, it's kind of like people weren't sure if they were going to return. People were out in this kind of static place where they didn't understand what was happening in the rest of the world. Often they would be isolated and removed from their normal lives in a way that made them feel sort of suspended. And you see that in all of these, you know, old pieces of literature, and you definitely see it here. So right from the top, we have this very important declaration on the part of Mariette Navarro that we have the living, the dead, and then we have something in between. Sailors are something in between the living and the dead. We can talk pretty freely about the 21st sailor that comes back on board after the 20 sailors get into the water. I feel like I can talk about that very freely because they, again, mention it in the jacket copy. So there is this like uncanny, mysterious phenomenon that's happening that feels at times very much like a ghost story. The presence of the sailor, he has blonde hair and like translucent eyes. In many ways, it feels very ghost-like. So we have the idea of like a phantom, of some sort of other presence that is definitely between the living and the dead. But more importantly, I think we're meant to think about all of the sailors who are like actual people who are alive and who are at sea as also being kind of between life and death. And I don't mean that so much because people who are, you know, riding on these freighters across these oceans are like at risk of dying and not returning to their lives, but more in the sense that they're kind of suspended, that they've kind of taken a break from their life. And the idea of taking a break from your life, if you think about it very much, it's sort of like you're kind of moving toward this idea of being dead because you are absent from your life. So the other thing that she's doing here, which is so interesting to me, is that thing where she has a declarative sentence. So it's just true. Like she's stating something as if it were a fact. And what she is doing is she's declaring something that's kind of philosophically impossible or linguistically impossible, but she's making it possible because it's in this declarative sentence. So I'm going to read it again. It's very quick. There are the living, the dead, and sailors. So when she's making those categories like that, you as the reader have to accept that sailors are a third category. And again, she does this thing where she's making these kind of mysterious, uncanny things into facts. I mean, 20 sailors go fishing. 20 sailors go swimming in the ocean, and 21 come back on board. It is mysterious in the sense that the men can't quite explain it. And there is a sense of like, is this person an actual like human being? But there is also an assumption. I mean, 21 people come back on board. She will state that at different places. And it makes real this idea of something that seems impossible. So one thing that she does right here in the epigram that's really beautiful and helpful is she expands a little bit on this concept. So she takes that one declarative sentence and she's going to sort of widen it for us in these following 3 little paragraphs. There are the living, the dead, and sailors. They already know intimately to which category they belong. There are no real surprises, no real revelations. They know, wherever they may be, if they belong or if they do not. There are the living, busy building, and the dead, calm in their hollow tombs, and then there are sailors. So in many ways, this is a time when I wish that I could really dig into the translation. But even if you're not someone who can really dig into those nuances, what she's doing here is kind of uncanny. So she's giving us these categories, and then she's saying they, which is interesting because she's already like creating a distance between the reader, who presumably is either alive, dead, or a sailor, which is just like even an odd thing to say. And so most of us, if this idea of like they already know intimately which category they belong to, most of us would identify just simply with the living part. So there's this uncanniness where we're having distance between ourselves and the people in the text already. And then she does that cool thing where when she's expanding on it, she actually puts in these little phrases that tell us more about the living and the dead. There are the living, busy building, and the dead, calm in their hollow tombs. So she's making a distinction there that's actually very concrete. Like the idea of the living as being busy building is very specific in some ways, Also, hollow tombs is also kind of specific. And the idea of the dead as being calm is also specific. So she's expanding on this idea, but she's also introducing a lot of elements of mystery here. And if you think about sailors, they're outside of that in the sense that they are not in a hollow tomb. I mean, if they were to die at sea, it's not a hollow tomb. And they are not people who are building things. They are moving and they're transporting things, but they're not busy building. They're not building their lives. They're in another category. So I'm going to read the final sentence here. There are the living, busy building, and the dead, calm in their hollow tombs. And there are sailors. So it's important there that in both of these cases, we have the living, the dead, and sailors. It's important in this last iteration, and there are sailors. She's not saying the sailors. So if she were to have the definite article there, if the last line read, and there are the sailors, you would have more of a sense that we are talking specifically about one group of sailors. But the way that she has this with no article, neither indefinite or definite, that makes us feel like we're talking about sailors as like a very, very broad category. On that note, I had kind of a weird thing happening in my head because sailor would be the word I think that you would use for someone on a freighter, but like they're definitely not sailing in the sense that they're not sailing with sails. And I actually don't know what you would call someone who works on a freighter. I guess a sailor. In French, it's different. It's marin. And marin, like it's M-A-R-I-N-S, which has a lot to do with the ocean. So it has like someone who's like, but you couldn't say a marine in English because that obviously has different connotations. The translator chose to say sailors. In both translations, it says sailors. And I like it because one of the things that this does for us, and we're going to allude to this later, but not dig in too deeply, is it really puts this story, this idea of this ultramarine and this kind of mystery and this tale at sea that we are about to hear, it puts it in a long line of sailors. So if we're talking about, Odysseus from like way back in antiquity, and then we have sailor stories, I mean, these are stories that are hugely in the collective imagination. We have Moby Dick, we have 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now I'm realizing that like I as a person, I'm not like a huge like ocean adventure story reader. Actually, I'm now thinking of that book, but I think it was Sebastian Junger, maybe, A Perfect Storm. I mean, there are all sorts of big stories about adventure at sea. And if you want to join, obviously there are no freighters in ancient Greece, so you would have to sort of join this long list of sailors. And I love the way that ties this into antiquity. So in this epigram, we have her kind of expanding on this idea of the living, the dead, and sailors, and we have her expanding it even further a little bit later in the book. So I want to look at two instances where she is expanding on this idea later in the text, and that is something that is a very kind of poetic thing to do. It's sort of like if you had a refrain, which I love it when poets, I mean, you all know that I'm not like a huge poetry person, but I do love it when there's, I mean, it's like a callback in some sort of a comedic way. When you have a phrase that repeats itself, it's often helping to clarify what we're supposed to be prioritizing in any poem. But it's also deeply kind of comforting. And every time we return to the thing, we are returning to it with a slightly different context, which is really important. So she's doing this thing where she repeats verbatim on page 35. She repeats the same sentence, but then she expands it further in a way that is so beautiful. By the way, as I was looking through my book right now just to find the page numbers, there is so much in here that we are not going to be able to discuss. It's really, practically a novella, and yet it is so rich, but kind of deceivingly rich because the prose itself is very declarative, very straightforward. And because we are in this context, like because physically we are on the ship, and obviously there's a lot of like variety to the different places on the ship, but you have this sense of things as being kind of small. Also in terms of time, this is all happening within a few hours. Not a few hours, I guess it's like a day. But for a book that is short in length and is sort of contained in terms of geography and time, it really is very rich. I actually, on that note, I mean, boy, apparently I'm going to be digressing a lot today, but hopefully these digressions are as interesting to you as they are fun for me. But what this does is it really reminds me of the fact that Navarro is a playwright. So she said in one of the interviews that originally this was going to be a play, but there was too much silence, which is just like such a beautiful thing to say. But the fact that we have this cast of characters that's fairly narrow and that we have, a relatively short amount of time, and we also have like a relatively small geographical space or physical space. All of those things are things that lend themselves or that come in some ways from the theater. They actually come from like classical drama. There's something called classical unities in drama, in classical drama, which means that everything is happening in 24 hours in a specific place and with one cast of characters. And you can understand why that would be important. And it's very interesting the way that it is manifesting itself here. So we have this nice refrain on page 35 where she's returning to the idea. There are the living, the dead, and sailors, which is interesting because it's like just a verbatim repetition. But then she goes on. You can still be breathing and already be dead. You can be discreet and terribly alive. You can carry the ocean within you, having never smelled the odor of salt, having never even left the countryside or the city. You know whether you're dead or a sailor, even stuck on land. You know when you're drifting, when you're just passing by, when the ground isn't solid under your feet. You know when you're from a place without really being so, always summoned by the next departure. So I'm not going to dig deeply into this, or we're never going to get through all I want to talk about. But what we have here are all of those kinds of concepts where they're things that are impossible, but they're very close to being possible. The idea of you can still be breathing and already be dead. What we're talking about is a metaphorical sort of death. And then she is sort of building on that with the topic sentence of the next paragraph. You know whether you're dead or a sailor, even stuck on land. So she's talking about a group of people, even if they are all, just living in a city awaiting their next journey. There is a distinction there between the living, the dead, and the sailors. So, and then we move on. There are sailors, some of whom have never seen the sea and who would never call themselves by this name they don't even know. They share some quality with the dead, even when you're talking to them, even when you're pulling them toward life to ward off their despair, even as you touch them and extract promises from them. And then a little further down, she could say of all the people she's met in her life what they are and what awaits them, wandering or anchoring down, home or perpetual departure, verticality or the infinite horizon. It makes no difference, but it's her way of reading the world. I mean, honestly, I'm tempted to just keep reading and reading, in part because if this is a book, it just keeps feeling like a big book, even though it is so tiny. This is a book where there's a lot of mystery and a lot of intrigue that isn't clearly resolved for us. But if we go back to the beginning in these early pages, she's really telling us how we should interpret them. That was also an interesting thing because they were talking about she could say of all the people she's met in her life what they are. That's an interesting thing to note because it's telling us everything about the narrative voice. Lots of times we will look at narrative stance when we're looking at any piece of literature because it's a very good way to begin to understand what we are reading. It really makes a huge difference if it's first person, if it's third person, if it's kind of like an omniscient, like Dickens third person that's like, very far away, or if it's a very close third person. And this in many ways is a very close third person. In some ways, you can almost mistake it for a first person in the sense that we feel like the story that we are hearing is the story of the captain. That's mostly because we are very close to her. As these experiences are unfolding, we are like really with her. If she's like lying down on the ground and feeling, the beast, the like pulse of the ship, we are right there with her. There are a couple of times where we are with another character who is someone else on the boat, namely the first mate, chief mate? I can't remember. We'll get there. But occasionally we come close to the consciousness of other people, or at least to their actions, but mostly we are with her. In some ways, though, that third person narrator is very important because they need to have a certain amount of authority and tell us, in part, about this other person who has joined the ship. So we're going to look at one more place where she is expanding on this idea of the living, the dead, and sailors. So this quotation this chunk of text is much later in the book. It's on page 141. We're about 15 pages before the end of the novel. And I love the fact that we have this in the very beginning. We have it during one point in the text relatively early on to help us get sort of settled. And then we return to it in the end. And every time, again, if a writer is worth her salt, every time you return to something, any kind of a refrain, it's going to be new in some ways. Either it's new context, you have new information, or there's actual new information that is being conveyed kind of within the scope of this thing. So on 141, importantly, that she is talking to the 21st sailor, or at least she thinks she is. She's in a small space, and she's fairly certain that he is hiding there, but she's not in fact sure. On page 141, and this is the captain who speaks. I know how to hear things that few people hear. The sound of breathing few people would notice. It's a family trait. But you're better at this game than I am. You'll just have to be careful with your shoes. No tremor, still, just the strange echo of her own voice. Are you a sailor too? You know what I mean by sailor. I'm not talking about a profession or career, but that other thing. I think you are, a sailor, rejected by the land. Unbelievable, so beautiful. And I think as the reader in the very beginning, you should get that idea, but it's really beautiful that here she is articulating it. It's also very interesting that she's talking about family because her father, I don't think this is a spoiler, but her father was also a captain, and there was an incident with her father that is very important in the context of the book. And it's really interesting when we're going back and parsing all of this stuff to realize that she's bringing up the idea of family when she is having this conversation with that 21st sailor. Okay, we're going to move on now and talk about this incredible tension, this like mystery and this intrigue, and frankly, like the eerie nature of this book. And when you step back and look at these things, I've made a little list that we're going to run through. It is so impressive. It's subtle and organic and incredibly well done in the sense that it feels very natural. And I think lots of readers aren't like really cognizant of how these sort of building blocks all fit together, which is obviously a beautiful thing. She's just done like a masterful job. It's so much tension and so many kind of smaller arcs all fit into what is essentially a novella. So of course, in the jacket copy, we know that these people that the sailors have gone down to swim, and then we know that an extra sailor comes back with them. If this were a lesser piece of literature, you wouldn't be able to say that because the writer would somehow be like trading on the fact that having an extra sailor come back is going to be like this big mysterious plot point. But because, I mean, anytime something like that, like some big momentous thing like that is in the jacket copy, that should signal to you that like that is like the least of it in terms of mystery. That there are much bigger things that you are going to encounter. Or not bigger things, but just like certainly a lot more things. And we do. So you know that I don't have a great memory. I literally read this like 3 or 4 days ago. And if you asked me, I mean, actually, I'd probably be able to come up with all of these things. But I think, you know, if you look back on this book in a year or 2 years, certainly if you're me, you would probably remember the sailor thing and maybe not all of these other mysteries, but they are incredibly important in terms of propelling the reader forward. So right from the beginning, we have this question, like this drama of them swimming. The description of them in the ocean is so incredible. I mean, it is really like an incredible experience for these men. I think we could do a really deep dive, oh my God, no pun intended, about what is happening with them, the fact that they're naked. This is, for a lot of them, it feels like some sort of like a baptism. It is like a renewal. They also are using their voices in a very interesting way. They're getting closer to death in the sense that all of them kind of panic. They also become a whole unit altogether. I mean, it is a very kind of interesting kind of crucible that all of these men enter into. And it's very interesting that she does not. One fascinating thing from the interview that I listened to, in the beginning, it was just a crew. She just wanted the crew aboard. There wasn't the female captain. But she realized that she wanted to have like a description of all of them in the ocean, and she wanted that description to come from higher, from up above. So that's when she like added in this captain figure who would be kind of separate from the crew. She also said, this is amazing to me, the point when she realized that the captain was going to be a woman, that's when she realized it was going to be a novel. And that doesn't necessarily sound momentous, but it is crazy to me because the reason she knew it was a novel is because that is so fictive. It's just not like, it's so kind of uncanny. She literally said that it almost felt like science fiction. It felt kind of like speculative because there are, you know, just not many women who take on this role. This is also a very good time to let you know that she did not compose this novel while she was doing this writer's retreat, but she did a writer's retreat on a freighter. There was some kind of company, I think in association maybe with the French government, that had a bunch of writers, not a bunch, probably not many, but like a few, who were on a freighter, and that was their writing. I mean, it's such a crazy concept. That was their writing retreat, was to kind of hole up. I mean, most writing retreats, you hole up in like a little cabin or a little Italian villa, if you are very lucky. But it is very interesting to think of this writer's retreat as happening on a freighter. I mean, you would certainly be, isolated and forced to get a lot of work done. I was also fascinated by the fact that she was really sick. She talked about being really ill the whole time, and how for her it made it this very like corporeal experience. Like it was very embodied, the experience, because her body was reacting so much like to the ship. And I love the idea of that. I mean, I honestly almost imagine her like, when you're really sick and you have to like lie on the floor of the bathroom. Like I'm imagining her lying on the floor of the bathroom because she's like puking or whatever. And really feeling the throb of this engine that I'm sure does feel like the heart. I'm going to digress here one more time. It is said, and I actually think Dr. Seuss said it himself. This is a digression about Dr. Seuss. He, as a young man, he was trying to write copy or something. I can't quite remember, nonfiction certainly. And he was doing some sort of ocean voyage with his wife at the time. And their little berth, their space in the boat was right near the engine. And so he heard this like throbbing of the engine the whole time. And it was like a 2-syllable throbbing with the emphasis on the first one. So it was like da-da, da-da, da-da. So all of his writing has that kind of rhythm. It's the opposite, that little foot. A foot is like a unit of sound in poetry, and Dr. Seuss is poetry. I think it's called an anapest. I think that's right. Where the strongest syllable is first, and then a less emphasized syllable. It's the opposite of iamb, like an iambic pentameter. And iamb, which is Shakespeare, obviously, is like da-da, da-da. This is beginning to sound like total nonsense to me. But I did think of it when we have these descriptions of her lying down and feeling like that throbbing, because a lot of people say that an iamb is like the sound of your heart, like da-da, da-da. And so she's feeling the throbbing of the engine, very much like Dr. Seuss, is feeling sort of like the heart of a creature, that this boat might actually be some sort of creature, some sort of beast. That was a long digression, but it was actually well placed, because we're just getting we're still at the beginning of this question of all of these different tensions that she's accumulating as we move through. The first one being the experience of all of these men swimming. So you have the captain, and they ask if they can swim, and because of some sort of unknown impulse, she gives them permission to do this thing that is like highly verboten. She's really going outside like whatever authority the freighter ship, the owners of the freighter ship would definitely not be happy that the entire crew is getting into the ocean. But what's important here is the tension. So, these men are all in the water, and she's looking down at them in the water, and she's beginning to sort of have like worries, because she's sort of seeing them out there and realizing the vulnerability. This is on page 46. She worries a little that there might be a message in need of decoding, a call for help she would need to grasp in order to act. But what could she do then, except wave her arms wildly, yelling in turn? And here again, we have this idea of, like, when she's saying, like, how can I decode what these people are saying, what the sailors are saying? As a reader, you should be thinking about how you are decoding all of these different things that she is providing for you. But she's also simply talking here about the fact that she can't communicate with them. If they had a problem, there's no way that they could communicate it to her, because, you can imagine it would be loud. They're relatively far away. She can hear their voices, but nothing kind of like discreet. So we have this idea of the swimming as being dangerous. But then we have this idea of her like wanting to know more about them and like invading their privacy, either by reading their files or by going into their spaces. And this is such a crazy thing, because like they're swimming down there, and you're imagining like she's going to go off and start reading files, and she's going to like maybe go into bedrooms. And when she's doing that, they're all going to be down there. If she saw something terrible happening, I mean, I don't know what she could do anyway. Maybe you like can lower another life raft or something. But it certainly didn't seem like a good idea for her to like wander off. So when she starts thinking about these, as the reader, you're like, wait, I do not think that you should be wandering off and leaving them down there. So here we have this on page 46. To get to know them better, she could go down to her desk and consult each one's file. Using their identification card, she could start to sketch out their paths, imagine what drove one or the other toward the shore, These men with their Breton names, their Romanian names. So I'm going to stop there. Although I do want to point out the fact that no one in the book has any names. At one point they did have names, and Navarro said it was too limiting for her because any name tells you nationality. It tells you a lot about class. It can tell you about age. She found these identifying like features of these sailors as being too limiting. And I love that. I love it if a book has no names because it really does, it does a couple of different things. I mean, it allows you to sort of relate more to these people, but it can also make them feel very shadowy. I recently did a lecture on Hamnet, and I absolutely love the fact that the name William and Shakespeare, like they're never mentioned. A lot of other people in that book have names, but Shakespeare, who is both sort of like nowhere in that book and also everywhere in that book, part of the reason it feels like that is because Maggie O'Farrell does not name him. So it's very important that we don't have names. And it makes the ending so gratifying because we have the name of the island and we feel sort of settled finally and we realize the importance of names. But if you think even for a second about how different this would be if people had names, it's just very strange. The idea too of them not having names also puts them into kind of like a more mythical kind of realm. Like they become more like they could be like a fairy tale or an allegory or even a myth. I mean, it sort of makes the whole thing feel kind of broader. And in many ways, you know, these waters, like international waters, really speaks to the idea of having these international groups. And the fact that she's not even giving them names that are typical of their own languages allows us to imagine that they're like all sorts of nations. I mean, you could imagine all sorts of different people here, not just people like from Romania, as she mentions. Yet another quick digression here. This definitely reminded me of Orbital, that beautiful book by Samantha Harvey. She does sort of a similar thing. Those people do have names, but this is, you know, it's a very short novel also that talks. It has to do with the people living on the International Space Station. It is so beautiful. I loved that book. In lots of ways, it's interesting to compare the two. This element, for example, that there are no names here in Ultramarine, but we do have names in Orbital. Anybody out there who wants extra credit in this lecture can write a little paper for me comparing those two. Okay, but enough of those digressions for now. We have the idea of them swimming at the very beginning and kind of like, are they going to survive? Like, how is this swimming going to go? And then we have this tension where she's talking about invading rooms and then she does it. So you have her like kind of wandering off. She's showering. I was like, oh my God, somebody needs to get back and watch these men swimming. And so what happens there is we have the resolution of that tension. I mean, you sort of feel like someone's going to die or they're all going to die, even though you know that they're going to come back 21 instead of 20. That's probably an argument for not reading the jacket copy. But you are reassured by the fact that she wandered off and yet she came back and they were all fine. But then we have this new arc, which we also knew about from the jacket copy, which is this new sailor. And it's very interesting how it sort of plays out in kind of slow motion. It's not like this huge thing and they're trying to figure out the identity of this person right away. It's a very subtle thing, which adds to the idea of this tension as sort of moving through the entire novella. We also, about this time, have this idea of her like experiencing these kind of weak spells, these spells where she needs to be lying down on the ground. I mean, this is definitely a day when our captain is having a crisis. This is not her normal everyday day. And that adds to the whole thing. I thought it was very interesting. Toward the end, they ask if the chief mate guy, who is the medic, asks her if she's pregnant. And he's kind of worried about asking her because it seems like an invasion of her privacy. But I thought it was interesting that fainting used to be like this total shorthand for women being pregnant. I think that is no longer the case. I did a review of Franny and Zoe, and there is so much like speculation about whether or not she's pregnant, which drives me crazy because it's really discounting the more important aspects of that novella, or that combination of short stories, which is really what Franny and Zoe is. But one of the comments on the YouTube channel was a young woman who just like she's like, I never thought that she was pregnant. And I'm like, oh, good. Maybe the next generation does not have that like shorthand that like as soon as a woman is fainting that you should be asking yourself whether or not she's pregnant. So we have this, so first we have this swimming, then we have her like wandering off in their rooms and like not getting back or being caught being in their rooms. Then we have this question of the sailor, and now we have this question of like, what are these kind of like fainting spells, these weak spells where she has to lie down? And that is another one that sort of threads itself throughout most of the novella. We also pretty soon have this idea of the ship like as broken. Like suddenly the ship is not moving forward, which is a major source of tension. You have this question of like whether or not the ship, like whether or not we're going to read it actually as an animal, which that sounds kind of crazy, but we've already, accepted the fact that an extra sailor has come out of the ocean. So it wouldn't be like hugely different to then accept the fact that like actually the ship is sentient, that somehow this is like a creature that they are all kind of parasites on. She talks at one point about the harpoon in the heart of this beast. So, I mean, in some ways it is turning into an animal, but that is one of the tensions. And then we have a whole other arc, which is the idea of this weather. They suddenly are in this weather that is unexpected, and it's really all-consuming. It's like a wall, like a whole, pile. It's not a pile of fog. That's not how we would say that. But it's a very eerie thing that happens. I mean, it's totally debilitating because they also can't find themselves on radar. I mean, this goes back to like Bermuda Triangle. I mean, this fascination with the ocean and the power of the ocean is obviously like a major human preoccupation. And here we have the idea of weather and the ocean as sort of conspiring against these human beings. We also have the next kind of piece of tension that gets added much later is this question of her father. So we learn at some point that her father was also a captain and that he experienced something at sea that becomes like actually kind of an important plot point because it really inflects our experience of the novel. And I'll speak about that when I talk about like my sort of my best guesses as to how we can interpret this strange experience that they're all having. So the point of all of that is that we have this incredible tension because we have all of these smaller arcs. Some of them resolve themselves like the swimming, but some of them are ongoing in ways that are really like contributing to this weird kind of eerie, uncanny feeling of the work. It is so well done. So I just looked at my notes and realized that the next thing that we're going to talk about, I've actually covered a lot of this information. It was a discussion of the prose and this translation and kind of the circumstances of her writing it, but I've actually touched on most of these things. A couple of notes so that I will add is that when she did that writer's retreat on the freighter, that was in 2012. As I mentioned, she was working on a different piece of writing then, and once she was off the freighter and wasn't so like seasick anymore, she started taking notes for this work. And again, she thought it was a play. She thought it was only the crew. They had names. There were all of these differences in the beginning. And you can imagine that part of the reason why this shifted over time is because it took her a long time to do this. So she went to it, she went to a different writer's retreat and worked for like 3 or 4 weeks on this thing, the thing that would eventually become Ultramarine. But she wasn't satisfied for whatever reason. She put it aside. And then 9 years after the original freighter experience, so in 2021, it was during lockdown, and she got the work back out then. And as you might imagine, lockdown was the perfect, COVID lockdown was the perfect time to be writing about all of these people as being sort of enclosed and isolated, and to be thinking about death and life, and to be thinking about these weird liminal spaces and these times where humans are really, out of their normal lives. Another interesting point that she made that I really enjoyed thinking about this was that in the course of writing the novel, like the sort of main difference for her is that she hadn't ever really written psychology. So if she's writing a play, she's writing the lines of the play and she's giving them some sort of stage direction, but she's not having to sort of fill in what the actor will do. She's not having to like write about the psychology of these people. And in some ways, I do feel like we're kind of filled in some ways as to what's up with this woman and these different characters. But I wonder, too, if that sort of adds to this kind of shadowy thing, like this mysterious feeling that we have about all of these people. We both kind of understand them and also like really don't understand them. So I was very interested in this idea of a novel as being different from a play because you have to add in the psychology. She also said that she felt much more free as a novelist, which is really interesting. My interpretation of that is like she could be much more sort of wide-ranging and also, frankly, wouldn't have to have like the attention to detail every single syllable that you would have in poetry. And you also, you're not having to convey so much in dialogue, which is often what a play is. You're having to really make sure that every single word of dialogue that you are giving to your actors is, working really hard and delivering a lot. So I want to close by looking at the very end of the book, reading actually like some decent sized chunks of the text because it's so beautiful and it is so revealing, especially in the context of our conversation today. But I also, before we do that, want to just kind of lob out some of my interpretations for like what is happening in this book. Like, how are we going to interpret this? I will say, when I did this with Martyr, that book by Kaveh Akbar, I had like some like very concrete ideas of what had happened because he gave us a lot of indication. I mean, he did this masterful thing that is like a crazy thing where he gives so much kind of detail and all of it works and grows organically, but it allows for, I think, very valid interpretations that are very different. So somebody could interpret that this character's dying, someone else interprets that he is beginning a love affair. And the like miracle of this book is that I think you can argue both of them very, very cogently. With this book, I feel like there's sort of like slightly less that is being offered to us. It's like it's a little more open to interpretation, which I really liked. We did have some indications of, I think, sort of how you might interpret it. So I'm going to give you the ways that I was thinking about this presence of this sort of ghost sailor. But I do not claim that these are definitive. They were simply the things that struck me. So we are going to be talking about the plot here and the ending of the book. So obviously, if you don't want to hear that, you should tune out. So in terms of how I'm going to interpret this, I think in some ways, this figure, this kind of extra sailor, we can interpret that as a ghost that is sort of like a family figure for her, like a stand-in for her father, perhaps. This is a male presence who is on board the ship suddenly. And what we know about her father is that he had some sort of incident on the ocean where after he came back from that trip on that freighter, he never spoke again. So we have this idea of her sort of moving through the grief of her father by having to grapple with the presence and the absence, frankly, of this person. So in many ways, that person is present and absent. He has those transparent eyes and he's blonde in a way that like made me feel like ghost-like. And for me, it really came down to, well, in part, this idea of the presence and the absence of that person and having to sort of accept that. I think you could also interpret it as like a some sort of stand-in or some sort of representation for her like love people. Love people, wow, that is not a thing. But like for the people she's like passionately or romantically in love with, in the sense that we have this presence, again, who has a presence and an absence. And there are a couple of different times where she talks about, you don't get the sense that she's really lonely because she's in these different places, on land and feels very transient there and can't wait to kind of get back to the ocean. But in many of those different parts, we do have a sense of her as being a lover and as having a lover. So there is this sense potentially of having him, this presence on board, as being, again, kind of the presence and the absence of a romantic partner. That is a very good segue into the ending of the book. So I was surprised by like the concreteness of the ending and also by the fact that it was like kind of optimistic in my mind. It is definitely ambiguous. There are all sorts of ambiguous things that are happening, but I do think that there are some ways that it feels more grounded and like a little more clear. So at the end, we're having a dialogue between the chief mate and the captain, the chief mate also being the medic, also being her lover. And that is a conversation. It's about pregnancy. It's like things that we have questions and answers. It's one where, there's like some sexual tension that's there. And then, you're sort of like, is there sexual tension? And yes, there is sexual tension. And you find out that in fact there is. I think I liked the fact that she completely elided any kind of sex. Like there was no attempt, zero attempt to describe any sex. And whenever that happens, part of me is suspicious that the writer is just not confident about being able to write sex well. It is a very hard thing to do. And, again, if you're a poet or a playwright, I'm not sure you have to ever articulate a lot about sex, at least not the sort of graphic parts of it. But the fact that they are but the fact that they have sex does indicate to us that there is in fact sexual tension. We are reading that correctly. And there's some action that is confirming something that we are suspicious of. So also the fact that they have sex with one another, it adds to this optimistic thing, not only because they may go on to be partners, this may be this romantic thing, this longer term romantic relationship, but sex, most of the time, or no, that's not true, but a lot of the time in literature, if some people are having sex, it's kind of like an affirmation of life. It's procreation. It has to do not only with pleasure, hopefully, but it also has to do just with the idea of like the human race moving ahead, which is always an optimistic thing. I mean, it's highly problematic these days, but in literature, it is an optimistic thing. So I want to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and read a couple of sections, just a page or two at the very end, and talk a very short bit about what it is that she's doing here that is so good. So at the end of that non-sex scene between the chief mate and the captain, which as I'm saying that, it also speaks to the fact that this is an unlikely thing that is happening, and it's something else, kind of like the swimming, that is definitely verboten. It also plays a little bit with these, with the power position. You know, the captain is clearly the captain, but then this chief mate, who is, you know, sort of close in terms of authority, but he also has all the medical authority. So it's a very interesting kind of example of how when they are out there, everything that is kind of like hierarchy and everything that is ordered about the ship, even the number of sailors, is getting kind of wonky. So at the end of this like penultimate chapter, there are 3 sentences, and it says, and this is like at the end of the sex scene, "Do you feel that rumbling? What is it? We've picked up speed." So one of the things that is so interesting to me is that toward the end of the book, we see a lot of this where the language is not attributed to anyone. And it's very difficult. I mean, I went through at the end there and like tried to really figure out whether or not it was the captain or the chief mate who was speaking. But these are meant to be ambiguous. So we have a space break here on page 154 at the end of the chapter. And then we have those 3 lines of dialogue that are separate. And it's really not clear who is saying what. And often in literature, if you're really confused by something, you should take a step back from like trying to parse it and trying to like figure out exactly what happened, and you should think about the effect it's having. So the effect that it's having here is that they're kind of the same person. Like it's kind of interchangeable, and that speaks to the fact that their hierarchy has broken down. It speaks to the fact that, like, you know, in some ways their sexes, meaning male and female, are kind of like heightened, but also they're kind of like one person together. So it's very interesting when she's not attributing the dialogue to any one person. So then we have the engineer telling the captain that the horizon is now visible. Not only is the horizon visible, but like they can see what's happening. The GPS is clear, the radar is working again. That's probably the same thing. And there, just like pages before the end of the novel, we name the island. And she says, is that La Désirade? If my French is not super failing me right now, désir, like it's definitely having to do with desire. So it's also a feminine island, it's La Désirade. So you have this idea of like powerful feminine energy here toward the end, and the ground as being, you know, like a feminine, like a female kind of entity that they are coming across. It's like giving a little like Mother Nature. And as soon as they see land, everybody sort of switches into another gear, where a lot of the kind of mystery and a lot of the strange uncanniness about the voices and the names, a lot of that goes away because they're taking their jobs up. They are, you know, they can see the horizon. They're about to get off the ship. They're thinking about the containers. It's becoming, they're really moving back to like the people they are on land. They're becoming less sailors and more, you know, the people who are alive. So or dead, frankly. So on 156, we have this. Now the sailors are spread out on the ship, alone or in 2s or 3s. Those who are near each other speak in signs and onomatopoeias. They've crossed over to the other side of language. So, and that's very interesting, this idea that the ship is so loud that they need to sort of be speaking in international language, but language is really breaking down here in many different ways. So, and then we have this. Sailing at full speed, they rediscover their bodies. 20 bodies standing taut at work, which is really important because suddenly we have 20 people. And then we move on page 158, and she elaborates a bit about that. From up on the bridge, she mentally recounts the men around her who can no longer pry their eyes from the land in sight. They are 20. She knows now that she won't search the ship for the last one. As long as she can see beyond the engines to the buried heart beating its reconciled rhythm, she knows that all is well. She breathes. Suddenly, the smell of trees reaches them, and those birds whose cries and impatience they'd forgotten. The landscape is becoming clearer, and each sailor is accelerating. The decibels rise to the level she recognizes as they ready themselves to arrive at port. Each man summons his memory of docking and his knowledge of coasts. What they need now is to prepare for their return to speech, overwhelming and constant, to the shouts at the market, to the words that jostle in mouths to tell them all at once the news of this place since the last time. They have to become once again beings free to move about on paths in cars. And, as soon as this evening, they'll dance. I love the way here that she's describing all of these things that we take for granted, moving about in cars and on paths, but that is something that has become totally foreign to them. And then I love the idea of dance as being something that's kind of primal. This makes it feel very much like a Greek myth or some sort of like origin story. It's like a ritual will occur. Also, maybe because dance is kind of like a way to interpret things. It's like a language of its own in some ways, and it's also a way to relate to other people. So dance here is very, as with all of the things in this book, it's very poignant. And then we move along. This is the very end of the book. As for her, she'll swim at the foot of a waterfall. We'll put her head under the icy turquoise water. It'll be her turn to be naked in the water, alone in the world in this setting that mirrors the paradise of books and paintings. And all through the night, the birds will yell and fall silent in the morning, a world upside down. These couple of paragraphs are so fascinating to me. This idea of her swimming in a waterfall, like she's finally getting her swim. All the sailors got to swim earlier, and then she is going to be swimming. And again, we can see this as a kind of like a baptism. We can see it as a rebirth. We can see it as a cleansing. It's really so beautiful. And then we have the idea that things are still sort of mysterious. This idea of a world being upside down with the birds making noise all night long and then falling silent during the day. Honestly, I was like a little, like I have a question mark in my margin here because I was a little like, I'm not exactly sure what we're doing here with that. And when it ends with like a world upside down, I was sort of thinking like, yes, there's a hemisphere thing, but I don't think it's like obviously that the birds in the southern hemisphere make noise all night long. But I liked the fact that she's retaining this kind of mystery, like things are not completely solved. It's not tied completely, with a bow. So the very last chunk of the novel is dialogue between two people. Again, it's not attributed to anyone, and it is a little destabilizing because at the beginning of this chapter, like 3 pages ago, she's talking to the chief engineer. So when we have a return to dialogue here, at first I thought it was the chief engineer she's talking to because you imagine her up on the bridge with the chief engineer. But it becomes clear toward the end, well, in the second chunk of text, that this is the chief mate that she is talking to. So this is the lover. And because it is indicated that this is the chief mate speaking, he is the one who speaks first. What are you thinking about? About the paths I'll have to find again between the trees. You're not going home? I'll stay here for a little while. And you? The chief mate hasn't had time to ask himself the question. For several days, he's forgotten that dates and airplanes existed. Marie Galante appears now, eternally round. For the first time in my life, I have no idea. So I love that another name, Marie Galante, comes up here. Again, it's kind of a feminine name. It also has to do with gallantry here, which is kind of like, it adds kind of like a romantic nuance to the thing. But again, we have this real ambiguity there. I mean, if you're gonna kind of go back up to the top like I did and like try to work out who is saying what, you realize that it is probably, if we are alternating lines of dialogue, it is the chief mate who has this last line, the last line being, for the first time in my life, I have no idea. And part of me really wanted the captain to have the last word. But what I really loved here is this idea that the captain, who, you get the sense toward the end here that staying in one place for her is going to be somewhat difficult, but that it's something that she's been kind of like running her whole life. I mean, now I'm really like building up like a whole thing. But if she is kind of like a dead, that doesn't make sense, but she's kind of one of the dead in some ways, and a sailor, like she's in those kind of liminal spaces. that she has gone through this kind of harrowing experience and she's processed a bunch of stuff, and now she's able to stay, at least for some amount of time, on the land. You get that indication because she was in the water of the land when she was under the waterfall. But also, and more importantly, I think, when she's talking about finding the paths through the trees, you have this very, like, again, very origin story thing. It feels very primal. She's not talking about streets that she's going to walk on. She's talking about paths through trees. It's very, like, Edenic. And there is ambiguity at the end, but I like the fact that we're having this conversation between the chief mate and the captain, who are people who share, at a minimum, they share a lot of sexual attraction. And you get this sense that both of them, that she is going to, stay somewhere and that he is considering it. So you have this idea of them being open to feeling sort of more grounded and more in language and more in their bodies and more connected, all of which because I am a romantic, interpreted as being kind of a positive indication that maybe they're going to, not that they're going to like get married and settle down and, have the white picket fence, obviously, but that there is this energy between the two of them that's really, that has to do with pleasure and with community and with things that we don't see our captain having throughout the rest of the novel. So we're ending on kind of a note that's like a little ambiguous, and I'm sure that some of you were wanting like a more definitive answer. But I do not think that this is a novella that is really attempting to give us concrete answers. Sometimes when you're frustrated by literature or like just left kind of questioning, that is the point. We're really supposed to be questioning, like, are we as a reader and as a human, are we, like in some state of death? Like, are we adrift? And I'm remembering now that Mariette Navarro she said something very beautiful about this, that there are periods of time where all of us are a little at sea. I mean, in English, we even have that expression. We talk about being unmoored. We talk about being at sea. We talk about drifting. Like, everyone goes through these periods. And she actually mentioned whether it's like a depression or whether it's a time of physical, infirmity, that there are these times when where we're not quite of the living and not quite of the dead. So you get the sense that perhaps when they are entering into this world that is very sort of tropical and Edenic and very kind of lush and sumptuous and beautiful with plants and paths and birds, that it is kind of like life-affirming. So I think that's probably a decent note to end on. Wow, this has been a lecture with lots of digressions. Hopefully they were interesting. As always, I'm very appreciative of you all, because this is a book that really, really called out, I think, for some real diving into. It was a book that is very small, but offered so much. And honestly, in some ways, I feel like we have barely scratched the surface, because there is so much in here we could have discussed. But I hope all of this gave you insight and helped you appreciate Ultramarine just a little more. So thank you for tuning in. Happy reading.